We're on the top of Daf Pei Hey Amud Beis, and we're learning Rabbi Yochanan. Aval lahachios. If let's say we need this person who is already condemned to death, and he's a Kohen, and we need him to come and testify in a Beis Din, is afilu me'al mizbechi. Rabbi Yochanan says that in such a case, we will take him into Beis Din so that he could testify and perhaps save the life of someone who's in court on judgment and being judged for possibly death penalty. And that applies even if he's in the middle of his avoda. We will have him terminate his avoda in order to save a life by giving testimony. Umazeh. This is the logic of Rabbi Akiva. Shesafek yesh mamish b'dvarav, safek yesh mamish b'dvarav. We don't know whether or not this Kohen has real evidence and his testimony will be accepted. So it's a suffix whether he's going to save someone's life. And yet, the avod, the dochas HaShabbos, avod in the Beis HaMikdash is more severe than Shabbos because the avodas of the Korbanos HaTzibur, which have a set time period, override the Shabbos. And nevertheless, we're going to have him stop and terminate in the middle of his avodah because of suffix, pikuach nefesh. Maybe he'll save someone's life. It's kavachomer. How much more so lepikuach nefesh dochas haShabbos? How much more so that if pikuach nefesh is docha avodah and avodah is greater than Shabbos, then how much more so would suffix pikuach nefesh override the Shabbos? Nene Rabbi Elazar v'Yomar Uma Mila. Let's derive it from Mila. Shehi echad mi masayim ve'arboim u'shmonei varv sheba adam. The bris milah is one of 248 limbs of a person. Midoches haShabbos. Nevertheless, it overrides the Shabbos. Kal v'chomer. How much more so in the case of pikuach nefesh, which is l'chol gufo, we can save his entire body. Certainly, doches haShabbos. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Eshab sosei tishmoru yachol lakol. I might think that in all situations, even in the case of sakanis nefashos, we have to observe the Shabbos. Tamalomer ach eshab sosei tishmoru. Ach is chilek. Ach is always a miut, and it's telling me that there are situations in which you don't observe the Shabbos. You're not required to observe the Shabbos because it's pikuach nefesh. Rabbi Yonasan ben Yosef Omer. It says ushmartu is a Shabbos ki kodeshi lachem, and the word lachem is redundant. Shehi mesura biyedcha. That to some extent the Shabbos is in your hands. The law atem mesurim biyada. And it's not the other way around that your lives are given over to the hands of Shabbos for Shmir Shabbos, and therefore you're allowed to be Mechal Shabbos for Atzolos Nefashos. Reb Shimon ben Nasi Omer v'Shomanei Sosa Shabbos. Omer Torah Chalel of Shabbos Achas Kidei Sheyishmar Shabbosos Harbe. We're going to violate the Shabbos one time in order to benefit from all the future Shabbosos, the many Shabbosos that this person that we save will observe the Shabbos. So V'Shomer Yisrael Shabbos means maximize the Shmir Shabbos. And how do we do that? By overriding the Shabbos on one occasion to save the life of this victim whose life is now in danger. And according to this drasha of Reb Shimon ben Menasya, it comes out that we would not be Mechal Shabbos unless we can assume that he'll be Mekayim many Shabbos down the line. But in the case of Chai Shah, if you remember, we discussed it on an Aleph, where we're only going to extend his life, but he'll never be able to observe the Shabbos, then we will not override the Shabbos. That's according to this one opinion. And now we get to the sort of punchline, the crescendo of the entire sugya. Omar Rabbi Yehuda Omar Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, if I was there with the Tanoim and when they raised the question, what's the source from which we derive that suffix because nefesh overrides the Shabbos? Havamina didi adif mididu. I have a source which is greater than all of theirs. And what is that? The Torah says in Parshas Kedoshim, Ushmartem es chukosai ves mishpotei asher yaso sama adam v'chai bohem. You should live by the Torah. And that's telling me v'lo sheyamas bohem, that pikuach nefesh overrides all the mitzvahs of the Torah. So now the Gemara wants to clarify what did Shmuel mean by saying that my limud would be better than all the others. Amar Rava, lekulu islay pircha. Each one of the different shittas that we mentioned, I'm going to go through all of them again one by one, have a pircha. and you can slug them up. Bar, with the one exception, with a shmuel, the less they pircha. There's no way of overriding and defeating the logic of shmuel. And now we go through all the logic. Dear Rabbi Yishmael, who wants to derive the law of Docha Shabbos from Baba Machteres, Dilma Kidarava. Rava is going to prove that a person who breaks into someone's house, he's a burglar, he is going to kill you. It's not a suffix. Your life is in danger. Why? The Omer Rava, my time in the Machteres. Why did the Torah say you're allowed to kill the Baba Machteres? Because Chazaka, we have two Chazakas here, two premises. Premise number one, Ein Adam Mamid Atzma Mamona. A person's not going to stand there idly allowing someone to rob him. He's going to stand up and defend himself. V'hai, and the God of himself knows that this owner is going to stand face to face and encounter him. V'yomer, and he says to him, here's the second chazaka, katilnale. If he stands up against me, I will kill him. Therefore, we have a situation that's not suffix, but rather vadai. He's definitely considered, he's bala hargo. And therefore, Torah Omra bala hargo hashkim lahargo, that in a case where someone's coming to kill you, you take the initiative and kill him first. The ashkan vadai, but suffix minolan. That doesn't tell me anything about a case of a suffix. To Rabbi Kiva Nami, again, we have a pircha there also. It's going to be a case of a vadai, even though we don't know for sure whether the Kohen who's about to do the avoda, whether he has clear-cut evidence. But Dilma Kid Abaye, the Amar Abaye, Masrina le Zugal Rabbanon, Leda im Yesh Mamish B'Dvarav. When someone comes to testify, or for example, let's say we're taking a person who's been condemned to death, we're taking him out to be killed, and he says, wait a minute, I know proof to defend myself. I have witnesses out there. So Abai says we will accompany him out to the death penalty with two Talmidei Chachamim, and they will start interrogating him when he says, I have testimony on my behalf. So here too, in a case where the Kohen who has to be brought to death, he's starting his avoda, or let's say he claims, well, I have testimony to give, we're going to accompany him with two Talmidei Chacham. They're going to interrogate him and figure out if there's any mamashis, if there's any real meaning to what he's saying. And the Mishnah says in Masechet Sanhedrin Daf Mem Gimel, if the Nidon, who's already condemned to death, claims that he has someone out there who's going to be Malamed Zchus, then we can bring him back to Bezdin, but Bilvad Shiyah Mamish B'Dvar, only if there's some substance to what he's saying. So therefore, again, the logic is Ashkam Vadai, Suffolk Minol. So the case of Rabbi Akiva, where we take him out to testify, and we give up on the avoda, that's a case of Vadai. We want to know about Suffolk. And the Gemara concludes, V'kulan Ashkan Vadai. We can go through all the drushes of the Chachamim, and we could always prove that you could derive almost only the minimum, namely Vadai Pikuach Nefesh. But Safek Minolim, we would never be able to derive the conclusion that even Safek Pikuach Nefesh overrides the Shabbos. Except for Shmuel. The Shmuel Vadai Lesle Pircha. But in the case of Shmuel's drasha from V'chai Bohem, it means that there's no Kiyum on mitzvos. Unless he's definitely going to live in a place where he might not live, then there's no obligation of mitzvahs. V'chai Bohem doesn't apply. It's got to be a Vadai V'chai Bohem. But if it's not a Vadai V'chai Bohem, then Safek Pikuach Nefesh overrides the Shabbos. Omer Avina, Ve'i Tema Rab Nachman Bar Yitzchak, Ava Chada Pilpula Charifta Mimelo Tzina Dekari. This is an idiomatic phrase that sometimes a very small seed of a pepper is even sharper than a full basket of kishurim. And Shmuel is considered in this mashal like a small seed, but he's very sharp, and he's greater than all the Tanoim with all their drushes. The Mishnah says, Chatos, the Osham Vadai Mechapret. It means if a person violates a chiyuv karis b'shogeg, he has to bring korban chatas, and that chatas will be mechaper, or an osham vadai. In the case, let's say Asham Gzelos, there are 5 categories of shamos. He brings his korban osham, and he's miskaper. Where's the tshuva? The very fact that he's bringing the korban indicates that he wants tshuva. Misa, the Yom Kippur mechaper mimat tshuva. Now, in a case where a person violates a very severe isur, what's called avonos chamurim, because in the case of an avera kala, he doesn't even need misa or Yom Kippur. All he needs is tshuva. But here's a case where it's an avon chamur, a serious violation. Then he needs Yom Kippurim or misa together with tshuva, and then it'll achieve kapar. Tshuva mechaper salaveros kalos. What are averos kalos? Lower echelon averos. Number 1, al bittul essay, and number 2, al los aseh. The alachamuras he tola achi yovo Yom Kippurim yechaper. But if he violated a serious avera, more serious avera than a regular lav, let's say a lav sheish pokaris, for example, then he needs Yom Kippurim together with his tshuva to be mechaper. Ha'omer echtov yashuv, a person declares I'll sin and then I'll do tshuva, is then, and then echtov, I'll again go back and do sins. In other words, v'yashuv, I'll continue this whole process over and over again. And I'll every time I'll do tshuva is ein maspika b'yodo lasos tshuva, which means he'll have no siyata d'shmaya to do tshuva because Hashem is not happy with that kind of an attitude. Echta v'yom kippurim mechaper. If he says, you know what, I'll sin and let Yom Kippur be mechaper, is ein Yom Kippur mechaper. So when a person deliberately sins, taking into consideration the power of the mechaper, then that power of the mechaper is powerless. Aver shebein odom l'makom Yom Kippur mechaper. Yom Kippurim is meaningful as a mechaper for sins between man and God, but avero shebein odom l'chavero. If it's between man and fellow man, ein Yom Kippurim mechaper ad sheyiratzes chavero, until he asks ritzui from his chaver, and he asks his friend to be mochel him, and he wants to reestablish the friendship. Then Yom Kippur could be mechaper. Darish Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the pasuk says, "Ki b'yom hazeh yichaper aleichem v'chat l'dareska mikol chatoseichem l'fnei Hashem titaru." Avero shebein odom l'makom Yom Kippur mechaper. Avero shebein odom l'chavero ein Yom Kippur mechaper at jiratzes chavero. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah supports the original position, reiterating it, but with a drasha based on the pasuk l'fnei Hashem, meaning chatos l'fnei Hashem. That's where Yom Kippurim has the power of being mechaper, but with regard to Averos ben Odom l'chavero, Yom Kippurim is not powerful enough until he's meratzes chavero. Rabbi Akiva, Ashreichem Yisrael, l'fnei mi atem mitarim, umi mitar eschem. My Rebbe used to always say that Rabbi Akiva was addressing the generation after the Churban Abayis, so we no longer have the karbanos of Yom Kippurim. But nevertheless, Rabbi Akiva gives us a note of optimism, mi mitar eschem, who is going to purify you from sin, avichem shabashamayim, your Father in heaven, as it says in the pasuk, v'zarakti aleichem mayim tahorim utartem. God will sprinkle us, metaphorically, with the waters of purity. The Omer, and the pasuk says, mikveh Yisrael Hashem. Pasuk in Yirmiyah compares mikveh. What's the comparison to a mikveh? Ma mikveh mitaris hatmeim. Is Afa Kodesh Baruch Hu Mitayer Es Yisrael. And here we're up to the Gemara on the bottom of Daf Pei Amud Beis. But I think we'll have to take a break here, and in Mitzvah Hashem we'll pick up the Gemara tomorrow.